So, could you just write to me in the chat where you're all from, where you're connecting from? Texas, I see. Oh, must be at the middle of the night for you. London, Netherlands, I see. Oxford, good. Okay. Okay, great. Thanks for coming in. Thanks for showing up for it, especially for the ones who are here in the middle of the night. And as I already said in the email to you, this is going to be a questions and answers. I've written down some questions that we can go into today. And I also wanted to discuss a little bit the process of dissociation. Dissociation is a big one for many people. All right. Good. If you could name me one thing that really is on your mind that you want to discuss about, one thing related to post-traumatic stress, of course, that is really bothering you, what would that be? Anxiety, I see. Anxiety, one of the big ones, anxiety, as symptom of post-traumatic stress. Coping and moving on, I see. Intrusive thoughts, negative self-talk. And binding factors is what I call those kind of intrusive thoughts of excessive thinking. Okay, for the ones that just joined, there's a chat that you can open at the bottom of your video bar, and you can join, you can see what other people are saying. And for the moment, I'm just reading a little bit what people say, and bit by bit, we'll go into some of the processes that are part of post-traumatic stress, just to give a kind of framework, a layout, and then hopefully also do some somatic work, a little kind of interactive meditation, intervention, to not just talk about what's happening, but also talk into what's happening for you and see if we can shift something on that level. How to contain the self in feeling overwhelmed, Paula is saying. Good. Okay. Last week I met up with Rachel Grant, and she invited me for a podcast, and we talked. I mean, she had various questions around boundaries and vulnerability, which are kind of one of the pillars of how I work with post-traumatic stress. And I wanted to address a bit more in depth about boundaries today. I think it's very important. But I wanted to start with what I call the process of dissociation. And knowing that dissociation we often think of as a kind of a freeze response, something that we end up like a place we arrive at the end of our kind of feeling, coming out of a fight-flight state, then coming into a free state. That's an end station. But there are actually various levels before that. That's also part of a dissociation process. That you go from feeling overwhelmed, either be it through a period of time where you've been through abuse or you've been through a very stressful period, could even be a financial period where you're struggling. But I think most of the community here that's listening in has a lot of history with dealing with complex trauma, childhood abuse. And so often you've been exposed to a period in time where you've been feeling overwhelmed. And so you have different emotions that kind of build up layers after layers. And so there's a process of dissociation. For example, if you look at developmental issues where you couldn't speak out, for example, you didn't have a voice when you were a child, you were either met with more abuse or you were just being silenced. And so you kind of keep your voice in and you're not allowed to speak out. So there's very often a lot of anger there at the core. But because you can't speak out that anger because it would have been met with more abuse, etc., you might dissociate further from that anger into another emotion, which is what I've called a coping emotion. You might have If you read my material, you've heard me talk about that. So you have a core emotion, which is what overwhelms you. And when you can't stay with that, you dissociate further out of that, coming into what I call a coping emotion. And so if that's anger at the core, then your coping emotion might be anxiety or sadness. Anxiety, anger, and sadness are kind of your core emotions. And when you deal for some time with your coping emotion, even that becomes too much to hold, and you dissociate further from that into what I call excessive thoughts, excessive thinking. And excessive thoughts or excessive thinking, they always go with either guilt, blame, self-reproach, shame, embarrassment, jealousy, pride, self-righteousness, distrust. So that energy from being in the body, feeling overwhelmed, we kind of move outward into the head, into excessive thinking. And then probably even further, we move into some kind of addiction to release that extra stress, that extra energy. And addictions can also be very varied. It could be a behavioral addiction, or it could be substance addiction. It could be over-organizing, could be kind of obsessive cleaning. But it could also be substance abuse. It could be either drinking too much, or using too much medication, or it could be using drugs, or it could be food, or it could be YouTube and Facebook. So we can have addictions to kind of low-level degrees, but often with post-traumatic stress, those addictions tend to become a bit more pronounced, a bit more heavy. And so that's all tied up with the process of dissociation. And then at some point, you go into a more dissociated state. So if we talk about levels of dissociation, you go into a more pronounced state of dissociation where you're depressed, where you suffer from chronic pains, where you feel frozen, where you feel numb, where you feel lethargic, and where you feel fatigued. And so those are kind of the, how would I call it, the process of dissociation, or the mechanism of trauma that you'd see coming back in each type of trauma, be it developmental or be it incidental. This process of dissociation is also always present. And so it's kind of good to know, to have that framework to kind of understand how that works for you. How does that sound so far? Any reactions? Can you kind of find yourself in that? I see Rain saying, you name many things I do. Sparrow says, yes, please keep going. This is great. Okay. Right. Okay, great. Nice for your feedback. It really helps to interact, not just that I'm kind of doing the talking. What makes it, when we talk about complex trauma, it actually gets even a bit more complicated. So you have these different levels of dissociation, from core emotion to coping emotion, and then the excessive thoughts or excessive thinking, where guilt, blame, and self-reproach comes in. And then you go into the depression, fatigue, and chronic pains. And this is one system that you have as a reaction to one particular abuser, or one particular incident, or one particular period in your life. What makes it more complex with complex trauma is that you have two of these systems in place. So for example, if you have a very authoritative figure in your childhood that belittles you, that psychologically and maybe even physically abuses you, you suppress your anger, you have your core emotion as anger there. And then you have perhaps anxiety as a coping emotion later, and then also depression and excessive thoughts. What can also happen is that you have another incident later in your life, that you're exposed to an incident of sexual abuse or a car accident that is also very impactful. So you have another process of dissociation where similar mechanisms are built up like that, but with a core emotion that's different. So you might have, when you're in a car accident, for example, you're exposed to a lot of stress, you fear for your life. So you have fear as a core emotion. And then you deal with that as a coping emotion to get really grumpy, for example, or quickly irritated. And then from there on, you also dissociate and get into excessive thoughts and addiction. So just to make that clear, with complex trauma, you have kind of 2 or even 3, usually 2 main ones of these processes of dissociation that are kind of part of your psychology, part of your coping patterns, and they interact with each other as well. So one kind of stimulate the other. Not to make it too complex, but just to kind of get an idea of what complex trauma really means, is that you have these processes of dissociation, and then you have just not only one, but you have several ones, and you react in a certain way with a certain type of people. Perhaps when somebody's really authoritative, you have a job where an executive is abusing you, or you have perhaps a relationship where your partner is somewhat narcissistic or not being able to hold the space. And so just in a nutshell, kind of, we'll go into it a little bit later, either later on today or in another talk, but just to give you an idea of that. Now, when we talk about dissociation, how does that resonate for you? Do you suffer from fatigue or chronic pain or exhaustion? Could you write that in the chat box? Let's see how many people in the call. We've got about 25 people in the call. Okay, great. Thanks for all showing up. I really appreciate taking the time. So I asked about exhaustion, how that is for everybody, or kind of dissociated state. Exhausted, I see, very tired. Fatigue, raised temperature, fibromyalgia, very chronic pain. Of course, your stress hormones, your constant fight flight being activated in fight flight also raises your stress hormones in the body, and then kind of causing widespread inflammation in the body. Fibromyalgia is very often present with people who suffer from post-traumatic stress. Lack of motivation. I'll talk a bit more about boundaries and how you're kind of not expressing your boundaries, how that relates to not having motivation. It's also Sparrow saying pain all day, every day, exhausted most of the day. Chronic pain. So you see, just from looking at the chat, how common it is that exhaustion or chronic pain or even feeling depressed, and they very often go together, how much that's present. Okay, very well. Now, just as an exercise, if we can do something together, I want to see if we can do a few interactive somatic work in between our sessions, just not just me talking, only you're talking about, but if we can see if we can talk into what's happening for us. See if you're okay with either closing your eyes or kind of bringing your eyes down, either looking at your hands or looking at your legs. And just see if you can follow my voice just for a little bit. It probably helps me to kind of quiet down a little bit as well into this talk. But what happens often when we're dissociated, when we feel numb, when we feel frozen, we further react to it. We want it to go away. We want to get rid of it. We want to change it. We want it to be different. And that constant reaction actually keeps the dissociation in place, or keeps the exhaustion in place. And so we either go in one extreme or the other with it. We either react to it. We want it to be different. We want it to go away. We want to get rid of it, which is a natural reaction to have because it's not a pleasant state to be in. And the other one is that we drown in that feeling, how we become the exhaustion, we become the dissociation, and there's nothing else anymore. We kind of just want to put the blinds down and zoom out of this real world. Now, what I want you to do, if you can close your eyes, if that feels safe enough for you, or if not, look at your desk or look at your legs or look at your hands. But at the moment you keep looking around the room or the screen, you'll keep stimulating your thinking process. So that's why I'm kind of inviting you to take your attention inward. And we're not going to kind of get rid of dissociation, but we can see if we can navigate with that And one thing of it is to see if you can take away your reaction or slow down your reaction towards it. So as you close your eyes or bring your eyes downward, see if you can get a feel for how you react to your dissociation or to your exhaustion or to your depression, the thoughts that get involved with it. The wanting it to be different. Now, if you catch yourself there, if you can catch your mind doing that, interfering with what is, which is the exhaustion or depression or the chronic pain, as you catch yourself going with your thoughts, bring yourself back to just feeling the dissociation or the exhaustion or the frozen response as it is. It might not be very active for you right now. It might be more in the background, or it might be quite present for you right now. And also be vigilant that you don't become the exhaustion or the numbness or the tiredness, that you don't fully give into it. And what you do here is you bring in a variable that being present to what is, bringing awareness to what is, changes something in that moment. You take the mind out of non-duality. You take the mind out of duality and you introduce an element of non-duality. And you won't be successful to do that right away, or perhaps just to some degree only. But my voice might help to kind of center you a little bit, bring your attention to that unconsciously you're quickly reacting to that state of mind. And now we're starting with dissociation, with numbness, with fatigue, with exhaustion. And see how that feels. My experience is that exhaustion very often sits heavy on the chest. The frozen, numb state sits around the head, either in the head or around the head. And see what the feeling of that is. Perhaps you kind of feel it as being a bit outside of yourself. Usually what I've experienced, I worked a lot with people and with the body that they're a bit outside of the head on the right side. Or perhaps tension in the head. And again, just to repeat myself, not to become the exhaustion. If you feel it does start to pull you in, open your eyes, look around the room, bring yourself back, make sure to focus on my voice. And you'll have to see that the exhaustion or the dissociated state, it's not that there's no energy, but it's that the energy is invested in your exhaustion, is invested in your depression, is invested in your dissociation. It's a safety mechanism to not feel, because just below that not feeling is the activation, is your fight flight, is your excessive emotion that hasn't been contained, hasn't been worked through or processed. Okay, and come back again a little bit. I don't know if you close your eyes, but see if you can put something in the chat, just how that is for you listening to me, guiding you through this little exercise. How are we doing? How are you feeling? Calming, nice, Angelic says. Calming but also confusing. Okay, fair enough. In a safe place. Great. Okay. All right. What can also happen sometimes is that as you work through some of the kind of outer layers, dissociation, exhaustion, is that you start to feel suddenly a lot of emotion. Because just below that exhaustion lies the emotion, your emotion that very often you're kind of default to, be it anxiety or be it anger or be it sadness. Kerry says, I think it was important that you mentioned not to become the dissociation. Fair enough, yeah. It's important to not go into either extreme, which is what often happens when you suffer from post-traumatic stress. You either become the emotion or you become the dissociation, the exhaustion, or you want to kind of move away from it, you react to it. It's kind of the pain pleasure thing. When you're in pain, you want to remove yourself from it, and you kind of naturally gravitate towards pleasure. And so it's the same way, kind of more dense or not constructive emotion, state of mind. You want to either react from it, move yourself away from it, or you identify too much with it. And then you fall into that emotion and you become it until that goes on too long, and then you probably go back to a fight-flight state. Okay, good, great. I'm just reading the chat a little bit. Rain says anger has been coming up. Okay, great. Look at my notes a bit. All right. Now the next topic is that I wanted to address is boundaries. And I think boundaries is a big one as well, that it's very difficult to set boundaries when your vulnerability is hurt, when your boundaries have been crossed. Then there's often a lot of anxiety tied up with setting boundaries that makes it so difficult to reestablish your boundaries. Boundaries for me relates directly to anger energy. And when your anger is expressed in a constructive way, when you can express your yes and your no very clearly, then that establishes your boundaries. It's a constructive way of expressing your anger. What often happens though, again, when you deal with complex trauma, you've gone through abuse or neglect, be it incidental or a period in time, your boundaries are collapsed, and that directly impacts also your self-esteem and your self-worth. Now, what makes it so difficult to reestablish your boundaries or speak out your yes and your no is that there are very often layers to your traumas. And so when, for example, you default to a pleasing response, and you've heard me talk about that, I hope you've been kind of reading up a few things about me here and there, or listening to videos, is that the pleasing response, especially when you talk about child abuse trauma, is something you default to. It's also, I think, Dr. Porges calls it the social engagement system, and he talks about it in a more positive form. But I kind of talk about it in a more not so constructive or destructive form, in that we kind of default to a pleasing response. Pleasing means to adapt to others, to become submissive, to anticipate what's going to happen to you, or anticipate the situation and adjust accordingly. Now, what happens with that, you give up a sense of self, and you basically give your power away by defaulting to a pleasing response. And what then also happens, of course, is that you lack a sense of boundaries. You don't have an established sense of self, and that goes together with having a lack of self-worth and lack of self-esteem. Now, what I often hear is that when people start a kind of therapy where they have to start expressing themselves, or even being pushed by the therapist or the helper to kind of set the boundaries, or kind of be more expressive, that it kind of backfires. And I had a few questions around self-sabotage as well. Why is it that I self-sabotage? And that relates directly to that, is that when you want to speak out your anger from an adult point of view, but your child part in you said, oh, that's dangerous because you're questioning your kind of the need for validation, the need of feeling adequate, that you kind of act out through your pleasing response, that you're kind of putting yourself in danger there, because by speaking out your boundaries or your anger, you might miss out on feeling validated through your please response. I hope you get that. It's a bit subtle on a psychological level, but I think it's very important that, again, with complex trauma, you have to kind of look at those different layers, that when you work with anger and then either anxiety or the please response takes over, that you have to work with that. You can't just keep focused on pushing for boundaries or being more assertive or working on your self-esteem, because something else might be self-sabotaging that, which is your flight anxiety, or which is your pleasing response, or your social engagement system. And those are deeper wired patterns or systems that they live on a deeper level. The need for validation, wanting to be loved, wanting to be seen, lives on a deeper level in pretty much all of us, all of the people I see. It's one of the core fundamental things that people need. And when you look at babies, that's the thing they need to grow. That's the need to, they need to, through interaction, through safety with their mom or their dad, they build up emotional resilience, they build up containment. And so when that's missing, you default to, when that happens through a period, over a period of time, you default to a pleasing response. So just to check in again with the chat, I've been talking for a little while now. How's that sound to you? Does that make sense when I talk about boundaries, how that relates to anger, the difficulty of expressing anger because of the pleasing response taking over, or how you default to anxiety because you're triggering that deeper pattern? Yeah, clear, makes sense, pleasing but not being heard. Okay. Okay, great. Okay. So, is there anything particularly that you'd like me to talk about? I have a few questions here from the people that send me questions by email, so I can go through that, but I want to see if you can put it in a simple sentence, something that you want me to go into. I have a bit more material prepared, and we're half an hour in now. I intend to kind of speak for half an hour more, or perhaps do one more exercise. I think I'm stuck in anger because no one respects my boundaries. Okay. How do I work through self-sabotage in a safe way? Okay. Okay. I had that question also sent to me. How do I deal with anger? An anger that might come up now, but knowing that the anger relates to somewhere of the past. That might be, somebody said, through sexual abuse, I have a lot of anger coming up and it seems to be increasing, or what do I do with that? And somebody else asking me, like anger towards an ex-partner that's been coming up for her, and she knows it's not relating to the present moment, but it comes from the past. And I think that's already a good thing to know, that you can recognize kind of what it relates to, because very often dissociation also involves a sense of amnesia. You deal with the symptoms, but you don't know anymore what it comes from, especially when kind of the trauma spans a period in time. So how to go about with dealing with anger. And it's a bit the same with dealing with dissociation. The approach is the same as to first of all, can you see that the anger is there? And there are various ways of working with anger, but can you kind of recognize it first? And so you move out of a sense of denial. There's a presence to that of what lives inside you, what's active. It might also be that anger is there as a default or coping emotion, and there might be a deeper core emotion that's there, but your anger is safer to be with. It's safer to feel or act out the anger, even if it's destructive, it pushes people away from you, or if you keep it inside and it implodes, it takes away your self-esteem, it takes away your motivation, etc. So I think first of all, it's important to kind of meet the anger as it is, which is difficult enough already because it's like a pressure cooker. You might feel that you're holding it inside, and either you're afraid it suddenly all explodes outward and therefore you keep it inside. But also when you keep it inside, it's kind of imploding. It does a lot of harm over there. So when I work with people, just to give you an example, and that anger is active, one of the things I try to do when they can't voice it just yet, when the voicing is too dangerous to do, is I say, okay, can you kind of cross your arms and see if you can contain your space by a physical posture. And I can even invite you to do that now. And maybe anger is not an issue for you right now, but just to feel that crossing your arms, or even in some exercises, I think Feldenkrais or something, they do it like that, you close your space, but you can't do this in public when you feel somebody's invading your space and you can't speak out. I think it's probably safer just to cross your arms and kind of keep them out a bit. And so we're talking a bit about anger there. I see some more questions coming in there, and I'll see, I can't kind of keep track of all what's being said in the chat. Another exercise, for example, to kind of give some expression to anger is to put a hand in front of you and see how that feels. If you close your eyes and get in touch with that, with the sensation of physically setting your boundaries. And this is a way of setting your boundaries. And I do this very often when I work with clients, that, okay, how does this feel when you put your hand out? Can you get a sense of that? Does it help you to create some safety or release some of that excess anger? Because you want to take the excess away. You want to kind of bring that away from the extreme, from either implosion or explosion. Right, I say Rain saying useless, okay. And sometimes you don't have to, you can't start with anger. You have to really work on the containment of that first, not so much go into the expression of it. And then in the later stage, as you bring the anger away from the extremes, I might ask a question as to, okay, that anger, if you bring me back in time, to what period in time or what person in time do you feel that anger relates to? And anger might come up in your current circumstances, but you probably know that the anger sits on a deeper level and relates to other experiences and people. And so you kind of give it context. To where it comes from, how it manifests. Okay, I see Daphne had to go. And I have another question here. How do you untangle all those trauma layers? Important question. Let me first say it takes considerable time, energy, commitment, and even some financial resources to work through that. I think sometimes the expectation is self-defeating, that we want to go too quick, too fast, see results. And that, you need patience and persistence to work through those different layers. And then what I always say, my approach is that you need a somatic part and you need the cognitive part. A cognitive part is where the top-down approach, where you see all those different layers, how they interact with each other. And so you have what I already, just to repeat myself, you have the exhaustion or frozen state or dissociation at the very top. Then just below that, you have your addictions, either be it behavioral or be it substance. And then related to that, you have your coping emotion and excessive thoughts. And then further below that, you have your core emotions. So you need a framework to understand how trauma works for you. And that takes away, just the understanding takes away some of the guilt, blame, self-reproach, and shame that you formed around your symptoms. So that's one thing, the cognitive part. The somatic part is to find somebody or find work, either online, but in person, even better, that can work with you with holding the somatic part. And there are many techniques to do that, but I think the basis of that is to move away from the extremes, which is often so present with the post-traumatic state. So neither becoming fully identified either with your exhaustion or with any particular emotion, which is easy to say than to do, I know. And the other one is where you're constantly reacting to what you feel. Say, for example, you're angry, and then there's the thought inside, oh, I shouldn't be angry, or I should be feeling more relaxed or peaceful. And so there's that battle going on in the head then, that energy goes in the head. And so I think it's important to move away from either extreme through somatic work, through feeling the body, through kind of grounding and bringing containment to what you feel, to kind of shift something. And so very often it's not so much about the doing something actively, but restraining the action, the reaction of your mind, to kind of bring it more into the center. And that's a process, really. It's a process of bringing containment to those different emotions or to those different layers. And it's within that containment that you actually start to process. Processing all of your emotional residue is a byproduct of building up containment and resilience. And you can't do it the other way around. You can do body work, or you can do shouting and screaming and releasing and all that. But if there's not sufficient containment, it will just become an addictive pattern. You will release through whatever activity that you do. And then because there hasn't been full understanding or full containment, the same emotion builds up again over time, or through interaction with your circumstances and your environment and people. So it's not easy. I'm aware of that. It's not easy. How does that sound to you? Very helpful. Good. Okay. Great. All right. I'll tell you, this is the first time I'm doing an online live call, and it's kind of funny to talk to a screen and looking at a chat. So okay, great. Okay, let me go through a few questions I wrote down here and see if you resonate with those questions. I'm sure how they apply to you also. I have a question here from Paula. Being triggered makes her self-sabotage and self-blame. Why is it that I do that? I think it comes back a little bit to what we discussed earlier, is that when you self-sabotage, very often there's a deeper pattern at play that's more important for you. I think I took the example of boundaries, when you're not able to express your anger because your anxiety, your pleasing takes over, and your anxiety and your pleasing defends a more core structure and more core personal identity of you that's tied up with feeling adequate, wanting to feel adequate, or getting approval from others. And so self-sabotage kind of kicks in that way, that you don't, the mind, that part of you, your child part of you, your unconscious part of you, doesn't allow you to become more of yourself, speak out, be more assertive, be more powerful. Then I have Donna, who says, how can I find out what has caused my trauma? And I think this is also quite an interesting question, because I don't know with any of you, but very often a sense of amnesia is present with going through PTSD. You suffer the symptoms, but you don't know anymore the cause. Right. Who else suffers from that? That they have a bit of amnesia, that is part of their dissociation. Don't remember most of my life. Okay. Right. Anybody else? Not wanting to remember. Okay, that's something else, Sophia. But yeah. And then there's also people who actually want to remember, but they don't remember. And I think, again, you have to start from where you are. And so when you feel frozen or numb or dissociated or exhausted, that if that's a constant, that you have to stay with that. And through following or through working through those different layers, very often information comes back to you. And very often when I start with somebody, I just remind a session I did with somebody in Canada. And she said the same thing, I don't remember much. But within the same session, she remembered a lot. And then the next time, in the beginning of the session, she said the same thing, like she doesn't remember a lot. And so the not remembering or the amnesia is a safety mechanism. There's a fragmentation going on of not feeling the overwhelming emotions too much. And we live in another part of our minds. And so it appears that we've forgotten things, but it's just kind of walled off. It lives in another part of us. And as you work through those different layers, if you first kind of listen to the frozenness, dissociation, exhaustion, you become aware of a coping emotion that's there, that's activating, and you work with that, you bring that back to the past, then suddenly some of those memories start to come back. Of course, some questions will help in that direction as well, when I kind of say, okay, if you follow that feeling and if you bring us back in the past, what's the first age that pops up in your mind? So without bringing in too much cognitive kind of thinking and allowing them to intuitively answer my question, they'll ask a question and ask, okay, what happened around that time in your life? And then suddenly it makes sense, because you kind of trace the emotion that they've been feeling kind of back to an event or a period in their lives, and things start to fall into place. So I won't focus too much on trying to remember, and kind of allow to sit with what is and use that as a guidance. And when the time is right, when you have enough containment, whatever needs to come up will come up. Sometimes when you push for getting something to the surface too quick, you might actually collapse because it's too much to feel at the same time. And so you have to be careful with kind of opening the box of Pandora. All right. Again, I'm reading some of the chat. Can you explain a little bit more about containment? And I'm terrified of opening that box. Somebody said clear. You have to be really careful when you work with complex trauma, and you probably know that already. When you work on your own through the complexity, those different layers, you very often cycle between being in a fight-flight state, feeling activated with anxiety, with being angry, with succumbing to sadness or grief. And then when that runs its course, when that takes up all your energy, or your nervous system energy, really, when that fires your nervous system over and over, you go back to a frozen state. And that's really so typical that you move cyclically between those states, the fight, flight, and please responses. And then you go back into that freeze response till that freeze response kind of has run its course, and then you go back into those emotions. Now, the difference is that because there's no buildup of containment, of holding those different emotions, that they keep cycling on each other. There's never a resolution. Just thinking about that question, can you explain a little bit more about containment? Angelica asks. So that's why it's so vital to work on that containment. Containment means that you can sit with what is as it is. And that sounds very simple, but look at your own mind. Even right now, when you feel either angry or anxious, how quickly your mind does something with that, how it reacts to that. How it says, I don't want to feel like that. And it might not be in specific thoughts, it might just be in intimations, in kind of subtle feelings on a more unconscious level, but there's an immediate reaction to what you feel. And so you're angry, and then there's, I shouldn't be angry, or why am I feeling like that? Or how can I get rid of this? Or, yeah, it's because of somebody else that I feel like that. So immediately through that reaction of thought, which is either guilt, blame, shame, self-reproach, embarrassment, guilt, self-righteousness, pride, you either project it outwards or you project it inward. And then what happens is you're actually feeding what's happening. You're feeding the very emotion that's being felt, that's active for you. And the other extreme is, and I know I'm repeating myself, but I think this is very important, is that you kind of wallow too much in the feeling, that you become the feeling, you become the depression, you become the anxiousness, you become the sadness, you become the anger. And that also you're feeding what's going on for you. And this happens so quick, this happens so on an unconscious level, that it's very difficult to catch yourself. And I think that's the first part, kind of the cognitive part, where you're becoming aware that you're doing that. And you're putting more wood on the fire. You're putting more fuel on the fire with those reactions. And so when you can catch yourself bit by bit that you're doing that, you're bringing a bit more containment. You're holding the force of that reaction and bringing it back to the body and starting to feel it. And that starting to feel it is a process as well, because you'll go in and out. You feel it, then it becomes overwhelming, you get pushed out of it. You go a layer up, you go back into the dissociation, and then you have to work with that. You kind of go back in that, feel the feeling again, you get pushed out, or you drown a bit too into it. You have to kind of do some managing techniques. And so containment is a process. It's something that needs to grow on you. And if you have the right information that pushes you in the right direction, of course that helps. It helps a lot. If you have somebody you can personally work with, or you can watch videos, or even doing this live call right now, you get a sense of not just what I'm saying, but also you get a feeling of what I mean. And that's the most important thing. And so you build up bit by bit, but by going carefully, slowly into the overwhelming emotions, you start building up a sense of containment. You start building up more resilience. It doesn't mean that what you feel is out of the window, but you're able to sit with it a bit longer. You neither start drowning in it nor dissociate from it. And it's really, like I said, the processing of your emotional residue is a by-process. The work, the actual work that you need to do is to build containment and resilience. And within that containment and resilience, the processing happens on its own. All right, good. Great. Let's see how many. We're about 50 minutes in. I really appreciate the interaction so far. I know, I mean, people ask me for more techniques or kind of doing a bit of guidance on that. Can I, if you like to, see if that you want to go into a bit of somatic work again, like we did earlier with dissociation, exhaustion, and see if that helps for you? Yeah. So yes, please. Anybody else? Or do you want me to? Wouldn't mind. Or else I can go through a few more questions. Yes, please. Okay, great. Okay, let's take anxiety and hypervigilance. I think those are very prevalent symptoms of post-traumatic stress. Yeah. So if I can invite you to close your eyes, or if that's not safe enough, kind of bring your eyes down, look at your hands or your legs. Knowing that if you keep looking around you or even at the screen, that activates your thought processes. And so that's why I'm inviting you to bring your attention inward a little bit. And when it doesn't feel safe to you, you can open your eyes again and look around you. We want to navigate those extremes of not feeling too activated, not feeling more anxious, but also not going into numbness and dissociation with that. All right, good. Now get a sense where anxiety sits for you. And you might feel either the busyness of your thoughts that relate directly to your anxiety. I shouldn't be, if only, those kind of thoughts. But there might also be a feeling in the body that is present for you. It might be all over, but very often anxiety sits in the solar plexus, in the middle of the body, just under the ribcage. And again, if that's safe for you, see if you can put a hand on your solar plexus. And see how that feels. What you're actively doing right now is you're tracking anxiety rather than moving away from it through reaction, through, I don't want this, I want to get away from it, if only I would feel different. You're negating that movement of thought. And you're putting the importance on what's the feeling of anxiety? Where does it sit in my body? And breathe into that. You might feel you're holding your breath as you do that. You're holding your diaphragm, which is a way of preventing yourself from feeling too much. So breathe into your hand that you have on your solar plexus, if you can have it there. And be careful not to become the anxiety, not to become too identified with what you feel. And of course, my voice will help you to keep you somewhat in the here and now, not allowing you to fall into it too much. And see what happens just by doing this. It sounds so simple, but it's at the same time quite profound if you apply yourself. And you bring in that element of awareness of non-duality. And you might feel yourself every now and then being pulled back into your thoughts. Or maybe another emotion comes up for you as you listen to your anxiety. So take that on board. There's not a one road to salvation. There's not a one way of doing this. You might feel you go in and out, or feeling anxious, going a layer above, going into the feeling a bit numb, because that's a safety mechanism. And then see if you can work on feeling the anxiety again. You might even go the other direction where you feel not just anxiety, but the anger suddenly comes up, or a grief or sadness comes up for you. And you might go back and forth between your deeper emotion, your more core emotion at this moment, and then back into anxiety. And we talked about those different layers a few times earlier this conversation. Now, without going, as we're working with a group, not one-on-one, we can't go into a particular history that much, but this is an exercise just to get a feel of what that is to bring containment or move away from those extremes a bit. And using the breath, using your hand, using feeling into, using awareness. And try to get away from a mindset of, I need to be done with this, or I need to overcome this, or I need to get rid of it. Because it's going to come in the way of being in touch with what you feel. When you're anxious and you say to yourself, I shouldn't be anxious, you divide it yourself. You become two parts that are in battle with each other. And that battle increases anxiety. Again, breathe in and out. Okay, and slowly come back to the room where you're in. How's it going? How are we doing? A little more grounded? Great. Okay. It doesn't mean all your problems are solved, but you get an idea of what resilience or containment or grounding means. And also, you get an idea of those different layers. You might have felt you go into some excessive thoughts, take over sometimes, or you go into a more core emotion. We're gonna carry on for 10 more minutes or so and then gonna break it off. I see Sparrow saying goodbye. Rain, accept the emotion. No, it's not acceptance. Acceptance is often when you've exhausted yourself to try to change it, and then you go to another extreme. You say, oh, I'll try acceptance then, and then I'll see if something changes. So either acceptance or rejection are still part of the same kind of reactive mind. So I wouldn't say accept is the right way or the right word to use. But becoming familiar with what's present for you, what lives inside. I know it doesn't sound very appealing because it doesn't promise anything. It doesn't say, well, if you do this, you're going to get rid of that. No, it's much more complex. You have to be aware of those different layers and kind of really get your feet wet, your hands dirty. Controlling the anxiety, somebody says, yeah. I guess that comes in with anxiety, or even gives rise to anxiety when the mind wants to kind of control what's happening. It wants to know the outcome. All right, good. Okay, let me pick out a few more questions and see if how that resonates with you. I see here, Patricia asks, does EMDR really rewire the brain and give you a new way of managing your emotions? I think it really depends on the therapist that you find. If he or she is trauma informed, as they use that word nowadays, if he or she is very aware of the complexity of trauma and also can address kind of the top down and the bottom up approach, both the cognitive part, so you have a healthy framework you can relate to, and then the somatic part to actually work with the emotional part, with the emotional residue. And it can be like sometimes the technique doesn't matter so much. It's the insight people have while they use the techniques. So don't get stuck on the technique. Like you can have the best, fantastic, praised techniques to work with trauma, but if your practitioner isn't experienced enough or doesn't have sufficient insight, then the technique doesn't matter that much. Of course, it matters to some degree, but the technique comes second to the therapist or the helper. Then this is a question you probably resonate with. Gabriela asks, does CPTSD or PTSD really ever get better? It's a good question. I get it many times. It's not going to be easy. There are going to be breakthroughs and there are going to be breakdowns. And there are going to be reactivations or triggers from time to time. Even when you think you work through a big chunk of your post-traumatic stress, there's going to be stress again in your life where you fall back to your old patterning, your old nervous system wiring. I think the difference that you'll start to see as you work diligently, seriously through your emotions, through your post-traumatic stress, is that you start to rebound much quicker. Again, that cognitive part really comes in that you start to see your patterns quicker and be able to, with the techniques that you've learned over time, rebound quicker, get yourself out of the trigger and get yourself out of that kind of default nervous system wiring, your coping strategies. So it's really a process, patience and persistence. But yeah, you can get better. What I wanted to add to that is that getting better is not, you're probably never going to be, no, you're not probably, you're never going to be the person who you were before your trauma. It's not going to happen. And so I think unconsciously there's a process going on that we want to go back to a state that we remember that was before the trauma. And that in itself can also interfere with actually healing or making progress, because you have a certain expectation and that keeps you stuck from moving into a new you, moving into a you that doesn't relate so much to your old coping strategies. And that also includes that you have to change your environment. Sometimes you have to change either your work, the people you hang out with, maybe let go of some friends and make new friends or new activities. So you don't relate anymore to your old trauma. You don't relate to your old triggers, because else, you just keep falling back into your old patterns. Even if you feel you've done a lot of work, you've been through therapy and to therapists, if you don't remove yourself from an abusive environment, it's impossible to move on and move forward. Whatever, it covers the same question a bit. I have a question from Colleen here. How can I help my 11 years old deal with the trauma? How can I help my child, basically? How can I help my kid with moving past her trauma? Interesting question. I think we teach by example. And so when you provide safety and you have children or even friends, through that safety or through that listening, they're able to help themselves move forward. You're facilitating a process. I'm not the one, when I'm a therapist, in my therapist role, I'm not the one who's changing somebody else's process. I'm facilitating somebody else's process by asking the right questions, providing a framework, by guiding an entrance into what's happening for the person. And I think a mother or a parent does the same for a child, or you potentially do that for a friend as well. You create a space in where they can heal themselves. And with children, that needs a bit more guidance. It might need sometimes that you have to step up your boundaries. If your child is depressed or withdrawn, you might have to set your boundaries a bit stricter and say, get out of bed at this and this time. These are the rules of the house, in a loving way, not in an abusive way. And they might also kind of question your old patterns, that why am I not able to be that support person for somebody else, because you're bringing in your own things to the table that needs to be looked at. Right, good. So there's some questions I've already gone into, so good. Where are we? How are you feeling? How's it going? What do you get out of this call so far? I think we're pretty steady in the number of people that have been staying on the call. Right. Great. Okay, it's helping. Keep doing these. Okay. Great. Let me share with you a chart I made recently, and just to show you the stages of recovery or processes of recovery. Let me see how that goes. Oh, not this one. Sorry, I'm just looking where it is. You can't see my screen so far, can you? This one. Okay. Can you see this screen? Can you just say yes? Yeah? Okay, great. Okay. So I made a little pyramid of stages of recovery, and we've talked quite a bit about dissociation, which is really here at the bottom. I hope it highlights on your end. And so now it's in brown color. When you're dissociated, you're basically surviving. You're in survival mode. You might live with very little money or be dependent on other people to get by, on family or friends. And yeah, what you have to do at this stage is just to basically, you show up. You show up and you listen, see what can be done, get information, get a cognitive framework, and you set with an intention to heal. You might not be able to be successful with building up resilience or containment, and you have to learn what that is, the exhaustion, the dissociated state. You have to bring containment to the outer layer of the process of dissociation. The symptoms that go with that, you feel depressed, frozen, numb, you're hopeless, fatigued, in despair, suffering from chronic pains very often. So that's all tied up with being in a dissociated state, being in survival. Now, when you start to move a little bit out of that, when you go a bit further into the emotional part, either fight, flight, or the pleasing responses, you still feel overwhelmed, but you're not so dissociated. You come a bit into the struggling part. You're struggling with your emotions, you're struggling to get by. You go from fight, flight, or please, and you might kind of gravitate or rotate between feeling dissociated and then going back into feeling overwhelmed. But this is also the place that it's already a stage better than feeling just dissociated. You're able to observe or engage with some of your emotions. You're still reacting to that, or to them through your thoughts, through guilt, blame, shame, or self-reproach. But you might be more ready to reach out for help. You might buy something, an online course or some product that connects just some somatic work with some cognitive work. Your symptoms will mostly be dealing with your excessive emotions, anxiety, anger, and sadness, which are your core emotions. Joy is also a core emotion, but I haven't put it in there because it's not something that usually is destructive. And as I already said, you deal with those emotions. What comes with it are excessive thoughts and feeling overwhelmed. So very often in the beginning stages, you go between that dissociated state, surviving, and then which is kind of the freeze response. You go back into struggling, feeling overwhelmed, dealing with your fight, flight, and please, or your anxiety and anger and sadness with all the excessive thoughts that go with it. When you start to move out of that, when you get a bit more containment and resilience, as we work with the exercise of kind of navigating the extremes and coming a bit more into the middle, and you start to be slightly more contained or a bit more contained, you might be able to hold a job, you might be able to interact with friends or a social circle, which when you're overwhelmed or dissociated, very often is not a possibility. And you're able to have a bit more volition to act, to channel your anger as constructive boundaries, assertiveness, reestablish a bit of your self-esteem and your self-worth. What I said, setting boundaries, also that. We haven't talked much about vulnerability today, but it also implies having a sense of healthy vulnerability. Containment of extremes as kind of symptoms that are not going to one extreme or the other. And then at some point, which is where you're ready to go back into your life, taking up new projects, feeling motivated, get stuff done, I've put here. There's more sense of feeling regulated. It doesn't mean that you never get triggered again, you never have upsets again. You'll always deal with, I mean, life is full of challenges. You'll always have times where you're under stress and you default to some of your older coping mechanisms, but you're able to rebound much quicker. You're able to regulate yourself, and you have a bit more of a dynamic balance. You might be able to find the right partner, something that you love doing, and you have the resilience and ability to self-regulate. How do you find that little chart? Let's open the chat box. Okay. Okay, great. I think I've given you quite a bit of information so far, and I think it might be wise to bring it to an end. I'm making a few more of these charts, also the process of dissociation that I've talked about today. I'm going to put that into a nice design. A picture speaks more than 1,000 words, as they say. So I'm going to make this video, I'm going to make a recording of this video available, and you can get a picture of this pyramid I just showed you as well. And if you can just make a print screen of that, then you have it for reference yourself. So just keep in tune to an email from me in the next few days or next week. Then we're gonna bring it to an end here. My voice is kind of tailing off slowly. So last thing I want to share with you, maybe you've seen that it's been my birthday recently, and that I've been doing a little promotion for my birthday to get both the ebooks and also the audio course, the meditations, for I think almost a 70% or 65% discount. So I'm just going to show you that page once more if I figure out how to get there. Why doesn't this work the way I want? Right, okay. So in this page, if you're interested, if you go to this URL, maybe somebody can type it into the chat, birthday 40. If you're interested to work a bit more on your own, to the cognitive, the ebooks are a good reference to get a cognitive framework. Then the audio course is a really good resource to go into the somatic part. And they all go together now for 45 euros, or that's $49. If you're interested, then I think they'll bring you great value. Okay, let me stop it here for today. I really appreciate you took the time to sit through this session and do the exercises with me. And it's been really nice to have seen about 25 people consistently in this call, which I really appreciate your presence there. And if you have any questions, you have my email, just write to me. Also, I have one space free for individual counseling. If you want to work with me one-on-one, just send me an email and we can set something up. And I'll hope to see you on next call. Any feedback on this call by email is also very appreciated. And I'll hope to catch you next time.